thank our research team for being here today to present to Mr. Ben van Beurden your first research findings.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mr. van Beurden. Thank you for the opportunity to research such an interesting topic of subject, of matter that is very relevant in today's day and age. So as you can tell, we have done research on eco-terrorism, specifically on how it impacts Shell and other oil companies and what can possibly be done to overcome such a threat. And we did this with the research question, to what extent does Greenpeace condone eco-terrorism around the globe, and what are other transnational actors doing to combat this phenomenon? We think this is very important because Greenpeace is one of the fathers of the environmentalist movement, and their either support or condoning of eco-terrorism could have a very tangible effect on how eco-terrorism operates today. Furthermore, other transnational actors have a very big role to play in this phenomenon, so we would like to see what they are doing, because on the surface it does not seem as there is a lot of activity or response coming from the transnational community when it comes to eco-terrorism. So some key figures that we compiled for you. The first is that eco-terrorist organizations have become increasingly prominent and violent. So the eco-terrorism phenomenon emerged in the 1980s, around a few decades ago. And at first it was a very small, localized, non-violent movement. It was composed of people who believed that protests and civil disobedience were the way to move forward and to enact tangible change. However, more recently has become very violent and damaging to the institutions that it targets. For example, Shell or other oil and companies that are perceived to be having environmental damage. For example, 2,000 recorded attacks in the US since 1979. And 75% of US police state agencies reported that there exists a cell of eco-terrorists within their district, and that they do in fact pose a major security threat. And this would only be second to Islamic jihadists. So you can see the kind of magnitude that we were talking about here. It's a very real threat that real individuals and companies all over the world have to deal with. So between 2003 and 2008, you had $200 million worth of damage to private corporations. And to kind of link it to Shell again, we have the Brent Spar incident, which I'm sure you know about, but for the sake of clarity, we would like to explain it one last time. It was an oil rig that was off the coast, and they wanted to dismantle it. However, there was a debate on whether or not they should just sink it into the ocean, in which they claimed it would cause minimal environmental damage, or tow it to the shore and dismantle it there. And eco-terrorist groups, as well as Greenpeace, fought against the sinking of the oil rig. And in the end, Shell did have to incur a $41 million penalty, or they had to spend this money in order to remove the Brent Spar safely, as the issue was framed as. So as you can see, these kinds of groups do have very real impacts on companies and individuals themselves. And we kind of define eco-terrorism in the way that leading expert on eco-terrorist activity, Elizabeth Chalecki, describes. She says the lawful use of force against in situ environmental resources so as to deprive populations of their benefits and or destroy other property. So as you can see, it's a very comprehensive, encompassing definition, but we feel like it's very applicable to research and for the things we wanted to investigate and see in our study. So if you look at this graph, it indicates the incidences of eco-terrorism by region and target, and this was all done in the US. So as you can see, the majority of the attacks do happen in the Pacific Northwest, in which there is a lot of oil activity, a lot of logging and other practices that are perceived to damage the environment. And the primary targets of these actions are in fact business, with 17. And the next is government and private property. So you can see that there is a very clear threat to companies like Shell operating in these industries in which there is a perceived environmental impact. And this is just to reiterate the importance of eco-terrorism, the tangible threat it poses to the community. So what do we think of when we think of an eco-terrorist? A lot of people think of this kind of social justice vandal who is working, was fighting a social war in kind of a loose, network. There's no clear organization. But what eco-terrorism is also this. It's vandalism, it's destruction, it's damage to local communities and businesses worldwide. So what they say is factories don't burn themselves down, they need help from you. It says learn to burn here. And this was an advertisement by the Earth Liberation Front. So this is a very direct call to action from the civic population to enact actual damage on companies and environments in which civilians live as well. So there are three main elements of an eco-terrorist. The first being that they have, or they usually have, an uncompromising position. So when they must enter some sort of negotiation or mediation, they're very unwilling to budge from their position. And this makes it very hard for them to be included in any sort of conference or treaty or anything like that. And it just makes them very difficult to work with in general. Secondly, we have their status as a grassroots organization, which is this sort of image, in which these eco-terrorist organizations are not centrally organized. They don't have a headquarters, they don't have a hierarchy, but instead they have very local cells. So you would have a cell in Amsterdam, you would have a cell in Rome, which do communicate with one another, but there is no clear connection between them necessarily, but they do fight for the same cause. Then lastly, we have all the resources that they own are normally invested in actual physical action instead of things like lobbying, for example. And again, this ties into the uncompromising position, because if your resources are invested in bombings and vandalism, in things that are very physical and damaging to people, then they normally would not want to negotiate with you. And methods such as lobbying and buying a seat at the table or investing in pamphlets or something, this is not what they do, which makes it very hard to deal with these sorts of people. And similarly, it makes them also very difficult to catch and prosecute, because when this loose organization exists, these people are dressed like this, they don't have an identity unless they're actually directly apprehended at the scene of what they're doing. So this is another problem that exists in the world. It's a very low-risk, high-reward scenario for them. And these are some of the more prominent eco-terrorist organizations that we found enlisted. They're the Earth Liberation Front, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, Animal Liberation Brigade, and Earth First. And this is the Earth Liberation Front advertisement, as I mentioned. So the ideology that drives them, it's what you could call fundamentalist. It's very extreme, very kind of hard to adapt. You have to be a very strong believer in this ideology to actually follow it. So there are two fundamental concepts. The first is biocentrism, and it's essentially that every organism on Earth is equal and deserving of the same treatment as humans receive. So, this would be in line with cutting all environmentally damaging energy mechanisms, the halting of meat production, and methods such as that. The second is deep ecology, which is the desire to restore Earth to its pristine state. And what a pristine state is effectively the Earth state before humans had a very real impact on it with industrialization. So it takes a step further than biocentrism. Then, for example, that's when the bombing of factories or the bombing of car manufacturers, of oil companies, of slaughterhouses and things like this to actually return the Earth back to where it was before. And if you look at this graph, it shows the percentage of incidences targeting businesses, educational or government institutions, and private citizens. So the peak for attacks against businesses, which was at around 83%, was in 1999. And as I mentioned before, this was when the ideology really started to get a hold or to be cemented in something very digestible for the public at large. And it was composed of individuals that wanted to express their opinion through nonviolent protests, through demonstrations, through pamphlets, through rallies and things like that. But as time goes on, you can see that in 2005 everything kind of stabilizes. So you have around 40% of these incidences being targeted against business, 40% against private citizens, and 20% against educational government institutions. This is a very relevant development because not only are now companies being targeted, but also individuals that are very likely related to these companies. So this would be anyone in relation to an oil company or to a meat manufacturer or a logging company. And it does widen the scope of the influence of these eco-terrorist attacks. And similarly on educational and government institutions, so if a government is supporting a certain action by Shell or BP or a logging company, they too could be very real targets for eco-terrorists. So this is to express how in a more globalized transnational age, everyone is the target of eco-terrorists and not only the big oil companies anymore. A few more graphics that we came up with. This is a criminal acts of the rear movement in the United States, and the rear movement was a loose network of very small environmental organizations. And as you can see, their main methods were facility attacks, bombings, and explosions and armed assaults. So they're very violent, very direct, very harmful to both individuals and companies themselves. At 87.3%, facility attacks, which have the potential to kill people, have the potential to completely ruin an operation that, for example, Shell owns, which would cost millions upon millions of dollars to fix. This is something to keep in mind. However, when you look at animal rights movements, criminal acts of the radical animal rights movement, you see that the top three methods of protest or of reaction are in fact non-violent. They're vandalism, they're house visits, and they're animal liberations. So what you can see here is that historically, the environmentalist movement that encompasses Greenpeace, but Greenpeace doesn't directly do these things, but they're part of the environmentalist movement as a whole, they tend to be more violent than these sorts of radical animal rights groups. So that's something to keep in mind for the future and to understand how these environmentalist groups operate in their day-to-day.
Right, thank you, Benny. I will take it for a while from here. As we saw in the previous slide, there are a few types of action that eco-terrorist groups take. As described in this 7-type scheme by Hirsch, Hoefler, and Müller. First, there's arsony. Arson set things on fire. What they set on fire are mostly laboratories, as we heard before, factories, stuff like that, and it's usually really tied to the animal rights movements. These are kind of organizations that target specific laboratories that do testing on animals and etc. Then the second part, assassinations. Well, that's a very radical, very rare action to take by an eco-terrorist organization, and it's usually done also by lone wolves. These eco-terrorism organizations are very loosely organized. They do not normally have a strict hierarchical organizational structure, which gives lone wolves a bit of the wackos among the eco-terrorists the opportunity to use the ideology of the terrorist organization, of the eco-terrorist organization, and attack someone in name of that organization. Then for a third category is vandalism. As we saw in the previous slide, this is also very much so linked to the animal rights movement. Comprises of the destruction of property mostly, sabotage. As you can see here in the figures, the damages that are done are enormous. Approximately $840,993 on average. per attack. So this is a huge number, and as we saw in the previous slides, and as Benny told us, there have been a lot of attacks since the 1970s. So a total of $194 million have been lost between 1970 and 2007, or had to be paid by organizations or insurance companies. A next category is a more public and very much more out in the open category, which is bombings. Very rare, of course, and much in the media, much seen in the media. For example, we have the bombing outside the UN Climate Convention in Cancun in 2010. A very open area where, and also a very symbolical place, because it was a climate conference, which should be a place for people who are concerned with the environment to be happy, but for them it doesn't go far enough, as we saw with the biocentric view or even the deep ecology view. Then also we have an example of state terrorism, state eco-terrorism even, in the Gulf War in 1991, when Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army withdrew from Kuwait, which they occupied. They lit up and bombed every oil pipe, every oil rig, every oil field that they saw. And these fires lasted for more than 8 months. You can imagine what the damages were, and what the damage to the environment and the people of Kuwait and southern Iraq were when these fires lasted for so long, polluting the water, the air, and also doing enormous damage to the oil companies. 3 more categories we have. House visits and animal liberations are almost exclusively animal rights activists' direct actions. These, they speak for themselves as to what they are, and are mostly done, as I said, by animal rights movements. Finally, there's cyber attacks. This is a fairly recent phenomenon. We have not been able in this research to go much further into that, because it's a fairly new and also very complicated issue field. But certainly further research will be necessary to see what's going on in that field of eco-terrorism. To conclude this slide, what we see here is a trend towards more attacks, more damage, both economic and environmental, and to private persons, and more threats to companies and to governments by eco-terrorists to ensure that environmentally friendly policies are being pursued. Fossil fuel corporations are often threatened and targeted. Companies like Shell, but also ExxonMobil, the Chinese petroleum have been targeted. Millions in losses for when an oil rig is attacked, when an oil rig cannot pump oil up for a day. You can know what the losses are for a day, and imagine what happens if it's a week or a month. In addition to the economic danger to these corporations, there's a danger, of course, to human life and the environment as a whole when fossil fuel corporations are being attacked. So where do these eco-terrorism organizations get their funding? How do they pay for their operations? As we have seen in this example that we researched about the Earth Liberation Front, is that they get their funding from 3 main sources. That is mainstream environmental organizations, organizations that are usually seen as benign, like Greenpeace, that we are researching right now for this. We have not been able to ascertain whether there is a direct funding between Greenpeace and eco-terrorist organizations, but there are at least some signs. Then we have other sympathetic organizations and allies that can fall within slightly the same category, but it's not only environmental organizations, but also corporations and sometimes even governments. And for the last point, we have wealthy benefactors, rich people who care about the environment and fund in a radical way, that is, of course, and fund these kind of terrorist organizations.
And also poor benefactors.
Poor benefactors as well, yes. So to conclude, even if funders have the right ideas, even if these organizations have the right ideas in supporting the pursuit of environmentally friendly policy, in funding organizations like the ELF, like the Animal Liberation Front, like Earth First, they choose the wrong path because they are simply funding terrorism. What we have seen in the last few years is that there is increased legal action against eco-terrorism. Carson, Lafree, and Dugan, they researched this issue and found that environmental and animal rights movements have to consider legal action because they have been taken by corporations and by governments and by private citizens more and more in the recent decades, or in the past decade for the most part. So this is these sanctions and penalties that are being given to them, they're getting higher with the day, and thereby disbalancing also the cost-benefit analysis they have to make when they want to pursue a direct action approach.
So now we kind of come to the conclusion of our original research question. What about Greenpeace? In our research, we looked at the latest budget that Greenpeace proposed, and for this last year, and we saw that $37.5 million out of the around $300 million budget that they have goes to, quote, support Greenpeace organizations. And this is not, in fact, Greenpeace separate, like, subdivisions. For example, it's not Greenpeace Amsterdam, it's not Greenpeace, Zimbabwe, Greenpeace Japan. It's actually organizations that Greenpeace supports outside of its own organization. And this is what Uri alluded to before. You have, for example, the Earth Liberation Front. Greenpeace doesn't say here's $37 million, but they indirectly fund such organizations by providing like certain materials, like pamphlets, or they buy them time on a certain forum where they can go and express their views, things like this. And in this way, they don't directly incriminate themselves and they don't directly engage in eco-terrorism, but they do assist other groups in achieving their aims that could be considered eco-terrorism. Secondly, we have that the Earth Liberation Front and Earth First were in fact splinter groups of Greenpeace. So they belonged to Greenpeace before, and these individuals believe that Greenpeace should take a more radical step and a more direct step in addressing environmental issues, so they broke off. However, these organizations still remain close, or still have close ties and working in ideological relationships, meaning that these individuals still are in frequent contact. They have a similar ideological frame, just simply disagreeing on extent. However, that doesn't mean they can't work together on some more low-level operations that they both can agree upon. Secondly, Greenpeace has a history of direct action that helped define conventional limits and inspire further action. So as I mentioned before, Greenpeace is seen as this father of environmentalism, the one organization that champions the rest, and they are kind of taken as a benchmark. So whatever Greenpeace does is considered legal. And then these eco-terrorist groups can kind of take the next step. They use Greenpeace's information, their data, their, all the resources that they've accumulated, and can then go on to do further action. Thirdly, Greenpeace has been directly linked to certain actions against Shell and other oil companies that, whilst aren't eco-terrorism, they are certain actions that do contribute to the overall phenomenon of environmental protest, and as such they have a very real impact on companies like Shell. And for example, this is the Brent Spar. Greenpeace was one of the main advocates for its removal and movement to the shore. Taking all this into account, again, Greenpeace has no direct link to eco-terrorism. But to further take this analysis deeper, whilst they don't directly engage in eco-terrorism, they do not directly condemn it. So Greenpeace does almost nothing to directly condemn eco-terrorism, and thereby you can conclude that they are kind of silent condoners. And when you take into account the fact that Greenpeace is at the forefront of environmental advocacy as a company, it is their job to condemn such things. And when they don't, groups like the ELF and Earth First get the impression that Greenpeace does actually condone what they do, because they still give them these $37 million and they don't openly condemn them. So what are they supposed to think? It continues the cycle over and over again. So then, what are the other transnational actors doing? By doing policy analysis and discourse analysis, we have shown that there is no significant action that NGOs actually take on a day-to-day basis. These groups like the World Wildlife Fund, Earth First, China National Petroleum, etc., they don't take lasting and impactful action that have, in fact, denounced, impacted, or thwarted eco-terrorist actions. These groups will condemn certain small actions, and not really condemn, but in fact disapprove of in a way. But they don't unilaterally condemn eco-terrorism as a phenomenon, nor do they condemn these specific groups. And we believe that it's to the transnational actors to deal with the transnational issue of eco-terrorism by taking active steps to pass legislation, to establish norms, to name and shame, in order to actually stop eco-terrorism. So as long as transnational actors aren't playing a central role against the fight against eco-terrorism, then very little progress will be made. And lastly, we have our recommendations. So firstly, it's quite clear from the previous slide that Shell should engage in the mobilization of transnational actors. And here you can see that maybe they should host a special conference for oil companies to collectively create a plan to combat eco-terrorism, because it affects everyone. And by doing so, they would have a conference to centralize a lot of different opinions, expert opinions, information, resources from other actors who are directly affected by eco-terrorism. And this can produce very significant steps to fight eco-terrorism, because Shell would be positioned as this champion for this cause. And that would bring benefits to Shell in the example of a leader in the realm. Their opinion would be highly regarded, their input would be highly regarded, and just their public image would be elevated in a more positive light against a cause that everyone is universally frowned upon. And yeah, this is what that says here. Our social standing increases due to the direct steps to fight an issue that causes harm to both companies, but also individuals living in the areas affected by eco-terrorism. Then the next thing is that Shell should increase security at present Shell sites that are under direct threat from local eco-terrorist groups. So as we've seen before, 75% of local US precincts think that there is a large and imminent threat from eco-terrorists in their jurisdiction. And if half of those attacks actually came to fruition, then you can only imagine the type of damage and costs that could be incurred by companies like Shell if this was to happen. Secondly, funding further research into the specific risks that eco-terrorism poses in the contemporary age And as Uri said about, for example, cyberspace, cybersecurity, and hacking, this is a realm which is relatively new and requires more research in order to have companies like Shell be prepared and ready to counteract these sorts of attacks that are happening against them. And again, whilst no legal action can be pursued, Shell and other companies can take up naming and shaming tactics against environmental NGOs to make public awareness about the fact rise. So if Shell was to come out along with possibly this conference here and say, look, eco-terrorism is a very huge issue, these are the figures of how it affects us, and these are the figures of how it affects you, then this could help mobilize the transnational community as well as local communities to take a stand against local cells of eco-terrorists. And lastly, Shell does a lot of lobbying already, but if they specifically lobby around the globe to condemn NGOs for not taking a more direct step towards eco-terrorism, maybe then these local governments and local legislatures can work from a bottom-up approach that feeds into NGOs and, for example, supranational governments like the EU in order to take real fundamental steps to counter eco-terrorism. So that is the one interest of not only Shell, but of other transnational actors as well as local communities. So we would really like to thank you for your attention and funding for this project. And we hope that these preliminary results can actually have an effect on the operations of Shell and possibly fuel further research so we can have a better understanding of how eco-terrorism functions and how new threats like cyber terrorism can actually be thwarted to have a more holistic image of the phenomenon. Thank you very much.